Hey everybody, this is the chapter on motivation, and first the question is, what is motivation? And really, if you were to define it, it would be internal processes that initiate and sustain and direct and terminate activities. Most of the time people think motivation is just what makes you do things, but it really is this internal process that does so much more than just initiate something. And so an example of that is if you're hungry, that's going to initiate the search for food. If you cannot find food, then your motivation is going to sustain the search for the food and help you figure out where else to look for it. And then once you actually have found the food and eaten it, then the motivation switches. So you are now satisfied and don't want any more food. So the motive for searching is terminated, and now it moves on to something else to do. So in essence, there are three main categories of motivations or motives. So there's biological, stimulus, and learned motives. So biological, those are mainly those innate ones. And so if you think that they are anything that's biological, like air, we have to have that to survive. We have to sleep. We have to eat. Our body temperature has to be at a normal range. If we don't have those, then our body tries to get it back. And so I'll give you examples of that. But there's also stimulus motives, which is also innate. So these are just natural motives for us, but it's not really something that's essential for survival in the sense that, our body doesn't need it to survive. But curiosity, exploration, physical contact, those are considered stimulus motives that we want. There's also learned motives, and these are really not essential for survival like biological would be. But in this case, it is things that we learn, and therefore we find out, oh, we like that, so that motivates us. And so that would be things like need for power, affiliation, approval, status, security, and achievement. So biological motives is what I'm covering in this video because the other two will be covered in class. So for biological motives, again, they're essential because they maintain this thing called homeostasis. It's also known as equilibrium. So if it is in an imbalance or a lack of homeostasis, that would be called disequilibrium or an imbalance. When this balance is off, what happens, like I said a minute ago, is that our biological motives will try to bring it back. And it's usually automatic that happens. But if our body stays in a continued state of disequilibrium, then we purposely will act on it in order to get it back. And so I'll give you a minute. You can pause the video and think of different times where this might have applied. Okay, and hopefully you paused the video and now you're back. And so I want to give you some examples. What about if you're cold? Think about what happens in your body biologically when you're cold. And you might think, oh, well, you shiver. That is that biological motive to try to get the temperature back where it needs to be. If you stay in that cold state, so you are in disequilibrium at that time, and you continue to stay cold, you're going to purposely act on it by going and getting a jacket, or you're going to turn up the heat. And same thing goes if you are too hot. Let's say you're very hot and your body sweats. That is the body's natural reaction to try to cool the body down a little bit. But if you remain that hot and sweaty, then you will probably either take some clothing off or you will put a fan on or the air conditioning. Same thing when you're hungry. Again, your stomach might growl, but then if you remain hungry, you will go and search for something to eat. There's something else that's a biological motive, and that's our circadian rhythm. So there's a lot of different circadian rhythms. Most of the time when we think about that, we think of the sleep cycle, but it also accounts for things like blood pressure, body temperature, amino acid levels, things like that. So the sleep-wake cycle, or the arousal levels that we have throughout the day, it kind of varies, but it still approximates about a 24-hour day. And we are most alert or motivated when we're in our peak in that rhythm, which happens about once a day. And if you think about when you are most active and productive, just think, do you peak more in the morning? Like, are you more active, productive in the morning, or somewhere in the middle of the day, or maybe at night? So if you think about being a night owl, that means that your peak is probably later on in the day, where if you're considered this thing called a hummingbird, then it's going to be throughout the middle of the day, whereas a morning lark would be the morning people who can wake up and just get moving and get a lot accomplished in the morning time. So what about when that gets thrown off? So think about this. If you are a night owl, you're probably going to stay away from trying to have 7 or 8 a.m. classes. Because if you do, it means that you're not really going to get a lot of sleep, and then you're going to have to wake up early and things like that. So your circadian rhythm actually gets thrown off a little bit because of that. And so what happens then is you can be fatigued, you could be irritable, upset stomach, depression. A lot of these things can happen. This is the same as if you're a morning person. And let's say you're a morning person, but the only class that you can take is a night class. And so you don't actually get to bed until like 2 or 3 hours later than what you would typically do based on your circadian rhythm. And so, again, it means that your circadian rhythm is kind of thrown off. This also happens a lot with night shift workers, the ones that literally work throughout the night and have to sleep during the day. So some research has suggested that you could adjust that. And what you're really trying to do with that is you're trying to adjust your melatonin levels. And light therapy is one of the things that has been used to try to manipulate your melatonin levels. However, it does take some time. It doesn't just happen overnight. But you can eventually kind of, what they say, reset your biological clock. And it just means that if you go back again to a different schedule, again, it would take time. It's not like it happens overnight. All right, so let's go back to hunger, because one of the things we need to understand is that different motives have both internal and external factors that contribute to it. Hunger is one of them. So we can have internal factors, we can have external factors. And so let's go over a little bit of each of those. For internal, the internal physiological factors, so physically what is happening in your body and brain when you have hunger. In this case, different parts of the hypothalamus receive different messages from different areas of the body. And this is what gets you to either want to start eating, but it can also motivate you to stop eating. An example, in the hypothalamus, which is sensitive to a drop in blood glucose or blood sugar, so if your blood sugar goes low, the liver sends nerve impulses and the hormone ghrelin. It's sent by our stomach lining, which basically tells our brain it's time to start eating. And then there's a chemical GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide that is released by the intestines, which basically then tells our brain, okay, stop eating. And so the lateral hypothalamus is the area that actually makes us want to eat, where the ventromedial hypothalamus is what gets us to stop eating. So both of those areas in the hypothalamus get us to either eat or stop eating. And how do we know this? Basically research. So when people have had damage to the lateral hypothalamus, they don't eat. And then if they have damage to the ventromedial hypothalamus, they basically overeat. And internal physiological factors also include a weight set point. So our body really does try to maintain a particular level of weight. So that means if you try to gain weight, if you try to lose weight, eventually your body's going to try to get you back to where that weight set point is. You can change it though. So like, let's say you're trying to lose weight. Just eating wise, you can try to lose weight or you can exercise. When you change the metabolism, that can change what your weight set point is. And really all that means is that you're adjusting the speed at which the fuel ingested is burned. Okay, so if you have a higher metabolism, it means that the fuel ingested is going to burn quicker. So the question then that leads to is how much fuel do we need? So when I say fuel, how many calories do you need? Well, it could actually depend on what your BMR is, right? So the rate your body burns energy when it's at rest is what the BMR is, and it is directly related to the weight set point. And think about this, as you get older and less active, or if you get less active as you get older, that's going to lower your BMR. So it's going to lower the rate that your body burns energy at rest. And so it's going to increase the weight set point, which means that you will end up being larger. Maybe not a lot larger, but it will still be larger than before, and vice versa. So it works both ways. So what you can do is you can go into this link that's showing and find out what your BMR is. Now, I will say that when you do that, you have to consider that it does not take in consideration your body composition. So if you think about like bodybuilders, weight-wise, they would be considered to have a high weight and be considered not healthy just based on the BMR. But again, the BMR does not take it in consideration that a bodybuilder is huge because it's muscle mass, right? And muscle mass weighs a lot more than fat cells. And so that's just something to consider. But if you do the calculator, it will give you an estimate of how much you should eat throughout the day. I will say too, if you kind of play around with the calculator, you'll realize that if you just switch the gender, if you put in there female and they say you can have 1,800 calories in a day, keep everything the same and switch it to male and hit enter, it's going to then say like 2,000, which to me doesn't seem fair. But, well, to a lot of us, it doesn't really seem fair. But again, you have to think of what the body makeup is. And men do tend to have more lean muscle mass than women do. Women tend to have a higher essential body fat ratio. And that's because we give birth, right? So our body has to have the extra fat cells. All right. And again, there's a difference between essential body fat that protects your vital organs and things like that, and the fat that you get just from eating. So we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so hunger is not only driven by internal physiological factors. That means that there are some other things that influence your hunger that are external from you. So pause the video for a second and think what influences your hunger other than something biological. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and now you're back. And so what can influence you could be social factors, like external eating cues. Like maybe it's 12 o'clock, it's lunchtime. So even if you're not hungry, but it's 12 o'clock, you think, oh, it's the middle of the day, I need to eat. Taste. So taste can be how food actually tastes when you're eating it, which is partially biological, but also what about just availability? Think about if you've been to a restaurant and you have whatever your meal is, and then they give you a dessert menu or bring out a dessert tray. And you know that you don't need, biologically, any more caloric intake. But man, do those look good. The desserts look really good, and you end up getting one. So even though you don't need the caloric intake, you will still get one. So that's based on availability. There's also emotional eating. So eating because it's a party time, because you're celebrating. You can also eat because you're upset. And so even though your body does not need the caloric intake at that point, those emotions can lead us to eat. There's also cultural factors. So not just what we eat, but also when we eat. And if you think about this, if you or someone you know comes from a family where every single time you go to their house, they feed you. There's a lot of cultures that do that, and it's almost considered an insult if you don't eat the food. And so if you don't want to insult them, eat the food, but maybe don't eat before you get there if you know you're going to go there. And so those are just some things to consider. So this also includes dieting and eating disorders. So this was raised in your chapter, and I do want to touch on it. So dieting, first of all, dieting sounds like just the word diet sounds like a 4-letter word. And the main thing to think about what dieting is, it really just means what is your regular intake of fuel. It could be healthy, it could be unhealthy, or like most of us, it's somewhere in between. So you try to eat healthy, but you do splurge sometimes. So many problems with a diet, though, when it is out of balance, is a lot of times due to portion control, social emotional eating, or just eating too fast. So let's talk about those. For portion control, think about when you go out to a restaurant again. Think about how much they actually put on that plate. Most of the time that is not one serving. A lot of times it's a lot bigger. And so if we go out a lot and that's the portion we get used to, then when we're home, we will also pile on that same amount because just visually, that's what we learn as a portion. So it's kind of funny when you actually find out what portions are. So like a half a cup of rice or a half a cup of pasta, that, like if you put that on a plate, it doesn't seem like very much at all. But that's not usually what you see on a plate when you go out. Social emotional eating. I did just mention that a little while ago. So again, if you are celebrating, if you're upset, things like that can actually make you eat. As far as eating too fast, we do need to give our bodies time to tell us, hold up, we've had enough, stop eating. When we're eating food, it takes about 20 minutes or so for our brain to get that message. So if you are trying to eat really quick, like in between classes or before you leave the house or something like that, you might end up eating more than you need to because you're still eating while your body is trying to process and then send the message to the brain that says, okay, you've had enough. So a strategy for that then is take one bite at a time, enjoy it, enjoy the food, chew it slowly, and chew it very well. And if there's anything left over by the time you have to leave, maybe put it in a box or put it back in the refrigerator. So otherwise we end up eating more than we need to within a time frame. All right, so again, approximately 20 minutes after eating is when your body can get that message that you're full. So something else I need to bring up are the risky diets, which do include fad diets and yo-yo diets. There are other ones as well, but let's just start with those. So fad diets and yo-yo diets, they're short-term. They're not meant to be long-term. Yo-yo diets means that you go, it's kind of like a yo-yo, you're up and down, where you try a diet and then you go off of it, and then you get back on it, and then you go back off of it again. And so your weight fluctuates a lot. A lot of times the reasons that these don't work is because when we are dieting, and again, this is why it becomes a 4-letter word. When we're dieting, we have these feelings of deprivation, which are very frustrating, because when you think, I can't have that, I can't have that, I can't have that, it makes you want it even more. So that's very frustrating. It's also very frustrating when we hit a plateau. So whether we're trying to gain or lose, our body will change at the very beginning. And I'll just use the example of trying to lose weight. Your body might lose like 5 to 7 pounds at the very beginning, but then nothing, right? Even though you're still on the same path, you're still eating the same diet and moving around and things like that, but you weren't losing. And so that's called hitting a plateau, which is, again, very frustrating. And what happens too is your metabolism can also be changing with this. And so if your metabolism is slowing down, then that's going to also keep you from losing, because your metabolism is going to basically burn off what it needs to burn off, right? So if it's a slower metabolism, it's going to burn off less. And then plus, when we stop eating, the body gets really good at storing energy. All right. Well, I should say if we stop eating or if we eat way too much, our body's going to store it as energy. And really, the fat cells, that's all that is stored energy. And the theorists actually suggest, and this is from an evolutionary perspective, that this storing was something that our body had to do in case there were times when food was not available. And if it's not available, our body needs something to live off of. All right, but there's also an issue with the fad diets and the yo-yo diets in the fact that it has an increased risk for developing heart disease and also premature death. All right, so let me go right into the other part of the diets, which are eating disorders, because these are the more severe ones. All right, there are actually a lot of different types of eating disorders, but anorexia and bulimia are the two that most people know about. So I just wanted to kind of touch on those and help explain a little bit further. So anorexia nervosa is when people do self-starvation. And to be diagnosed, though, this is usually when a person reaches 85% or less of what their ideal weight should be. So if somebody is supposed to weigh 100 pounds, but they're less than 85 pounds, or right at 85 pounds or less, then that's considered very risky, and it is considered anorexia nervosa. But what happens, though, is that the body fat gets so low at that point that it becomes dangerous, because it starts to eat away at the essential body fat. And remember, that essential body fat is what helps protect our vital organs. And so if that body fat starts to be eaten into, then it can damage those vital organs. And if it goes on long enough, it can eventually lead to death. Bulimia nervosa is kind of on the other side. Rather than just not eating, it's considered that binge purge disorder. And really what that means is that a person who has bulimia nervosa will tend to eat a lot in one sitting. And so picture what you would typically have in a day and picture eating 10 times that amount within one sitting. And that's a lot of food. And usually people try, if they have this, they will try to balance it out by trying to purge it somehow. So either by trying to throw up or vomit, they could also take laxatives, they could fast, they can over-exercise, and things like that to get rid of it. The interesting thing, though, is this one's kind of hard to tell because people who have bulimia nervosa are typically in a normal weight range. Because by the time they do try to do the laxatives, the fasting, the exercise, things like that, or their purging behaviors, a lot of the calories are already consumed. So they end up staying at what is considered a typical weight range. But the risks of doing this is still strong, and the same as anorexia, where there could be hair loss, there could still be organ damage. You can have irregularities with your menstrual cycles, possible death. And of course, if you are doing the vomiting part of that, there could also be sore throat, tooth erosion because the acid from the stomach is coming up every time they're trying to purge the food, and a lot of other issues. So both of these are considered on the more severe side of eating disorders. There are, again, very many other ones. And even just simple overeating, like continuous simple overeating, that's one that a lot of us have. And a lot of that's just because we kind of lose track of what a real portion is supposed to be, or we eat when we're not really hungry. All right, so one thing that I do want to clarify too is that a lot of times people think eating disorders are just a woman thing, and it's really not. So 10 to 25% of people with eating disorders are actually males. And I will say that it's been a while, so I probably don't look like it anymore. I used to be a personal trainer, and some of the people I used to train had eating disorders that were men. So I wanted to give a couple examples of that. When I was training bodybuilders, they would want to do everything possible to make sure that their body was as cut and lean as possible for competition. And so they would go to extremes to make that happen. Right? So it became like an obsession, and they were not eating healthy because they wanted to be as lean as possible. It's not really sustainable to do that. And if they were to keep doing that, they could again be eating into their essential body fat, which can make them go into a coma. And so usually bodybuilders are the ones that I dealt with, and then plus ones that I know that I did not actually train. A common thing with them is that they will go to these extremes, and then once the competition's over, they go binge. So that's one example. Another one is, and this was down in Southern California, there were horse jockeys, and this was at Arcadia, at the racetrack, Santa Anita racetrack. The horse jockeys want to be as small as possible. And just to get, well, it's supposed to make their horse go faster, or that's what they think. And so I'll give you an example of one person that it was very hard to reach him, because his idea was that the only way his horse is going to win is if he is as little as possible. And so right before or during racing season, he would not eat more than a half a sandwich a day. And about like 3 to 5 days before an actual race, he would not even drink water. And that's not good for your body. But again, after the race was over, then he could go binge. And so just know that this is not just a female thing. And as far as just not only being in the US either. All right, so this is just an estimated percentage of Australian population with eating disorders. So binge eating disorder, pretty big, right? That's the biggest out of the others. Bulimia and anorexia are still considered big, but you notice there the dark green, and I'm not sure if you really call that green or gray, but basically you see the different colors of the bars, and it's very clear that there is both men and women in each of these, right? So it's not just a woman thing, and it's not just a US thing. So then what actually causes eating disorders? There's a lot of different things that can contribute to eating disorders. So body dissatisfaction or distorted body views are usually a huge one. And this is partially associated with media, but media or culture together, that's huge. And if you think about it, there are some cultures where a larger body is considered better because it's considered more healthy, more prosperous. And then some cultures where it's said that you are better off if you're little, right? And so a lot of that has to do with the culture that you're being raised in and what is being portrayed in the media. Also, fitness and sports crazes that require lean cut bodies. So I already gave you the example of the horse jockeys and the bodybuilders that I used to train, but also I taught dance for 20 years, so I also know this is huge in the dance world. And so people need to feel like they are doing what they can to be the best at the fitness or sports craze that they're in. And I say craze, but I mean basically if they're in a sport for a short amount of time, they want to do the best that they can. And a lot of times it turns out that they feel like they have to be lean cut, which does help to some extent, but not if it gets to the point where it's going to damage their health. So another thing for eating disorders, feelings of control. So sometimes it's not really just a food thing. Some people get or develop eating disorders because if there are things in their life that feel totally out of control, what they put in their bodies, that is one area where they do feel control. And so sometimes they over control, but it just means it's not just a body dissatisfaction thing or something about the fitness or sports or even modeling. That's another thing. Literally just feelings of control, because maybe in other areas of their life they don't feel like they have that control, and this is one area where they can. So as far as how to treat them, then you can't just treat everybody with an eating disorder the same exact way. So there are multiple things that we can try to help people eat healthier. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a good one to use. And most of that's just trying to figure out, cognitive behavioral therapy means find out how the person is thinking and how that influences their behavior. And if you can change that thinking, then that can modify the behaviors. And sometimes, even with cognitive behavioral therapy, even though it shows the cognitive is first, sometimes it really is changing the behavior until the cognition changes. And so sometimes you just have to eat better until your brain says, oh, this is why I need to eat better. Right? Rather than just trying to convince your brain first and then the behavior follow. So, but either way, cognitive behavioral therapy does work on both thought and behavior. And that said, sometimes people are not really ready for the cognitive behavioral therapy. They are not ready to help themselves, or they are maybe in a state where they need to get to a point first. And so sometimes there are medical treatments or medications that are given along with counseling. And hopefully what happens is that the counseling continues and they can wean off the medications. But sometimes it is necessary to put people on medications until they are at the point where they can self-advocate and they can work on the things without the medication. So it's just getting them to a place where they can work on it. And not just the therapy and counseling and medications, but we need a support system. And so it's really, really important to have support of both family and friends when we're doing anything, but especially if we have an eating disorder, it really does take the support system to help. All right, so with biological motives, that also brings up sex. And this is one thing that, contrary to popular belief, it is actually not essential for survival of the body, but it is for a species. And I say that because some people do think that it is essential for the body, which is why it's in the biological motive. But if you think about it, there's a lot of people who don't have it and they're still surviving. So there is a little bit of controversy out there on whether it is needed or not. But obviously, to perpetuate the species, it's needed. All right. So whether it's needed or not, what actually affects sex drive then? Well, technically, we still have internal and external factors that can motivate us. And so internal factors, if you think about hormone levels, and so those vary at different times. And we also need to think about the fact that hormones are both male and female. And so with men, androgen levels. And then, well, an example would be testosterone. And then with women, estrogen. And of course, they do have small levels of testosterone. And also, men do have small amounts of estrogen as well. So really the main thing is between testosterone and estrogen, there just needs to be the right balance in that person. And that is a factor that will affect our sex drive. All right, the main point of that is that an increase in hormones will increase sex drive, and obviously that means a decrease in hormones will decrease sex drive. So external factors, though, this really just includes things that are, again, outside of the body. So direct stimulation of erogenous zones. And of course, there are many places on the body that can be an erogenous zone. So usually we might just think of genitals, breasts, mouth, things like that. But of course, pretty much anything on the body can, because we have nerve endings everywhere, or pretty much everywhere. The brain also, if you've ever heard that the brain is the biggest sex organ, that's because of the fact that if our brain's not really in it, it's probably not going to happen. And so the brain is a huge thing. And this is just a little fun fact for you. There are thoughts out there that males and females do not differ in their overall pattern of sexual activity, meaning that they have comparable sexual interests and needs and drives, but they say that the peak, like when people are most likely to have that heightened amount of hormones and the sexual peak are supposed to be different for males and females. And so they say it's about around the age of 18 to 20 for males and about mid-30 for females, which kind of seems weird that that would be at two different times, like that far apart. But the more recent research is showing that that gap is getting closer and closer. And so I just think that that's kind of interesting. All right, so as far as it being similar, let's talk about that, because Masters and Johnson, and yes, this was back in the 70s, but we still teach it because it's something that is still true to the sense that most people go through these phases. So excitement phase is just an increase in sexual arousal. Plateau, even though plateau you think it levels off, their sense of plateau means that physical arousal intensifies. And then orgasm or climax, that's just the top part, and it releases sexual excitement. And then afterwards, there was a return to lower levels of arousal. So these 4 phases are technically something that most people go through. Doesn't mean that you do always go through all 4 of these, but this is the typical 4. Other fun facts is that 2 differences were noted, and that more women than men can have multiple orgasms, and that women can be sexually satisfied even without having one. So just something to think about. Now, one of the things that we do need to talk about too is the fact that there are dysfunctions when it comes to sexual responses. And so desire disorders, that's where you really don't have any motivation for sex, or you don't have the desire for that connection. You could have arousal disorders, which means you do desire the activity, but there are just issues with actually becoming physically aroused. Orgasm disorders can be anything from not being able to have them, or maybe they happen too soon or too late. And then there's also sexual pain disorders, and which that's just discomfort during sexual activity, which most of the time, if that discomfort is there, then it happens less often, or the sexual activity happens less often because obviously it's not enjoyable. So how do they treat these then? Well, medication for a lot of these is used, but counseling should also be used. And this is what a lot of consensus shows, is that counseling would be really, really good. And then medication if somebody's on it. Unless they actually need the medication on a long-term basis, it is more preferred if the medication is short-term and then they get weaned off after they have had the counseling, but the counseling should still continue. Okay, so that ends the biological section. And so everything else that we go over is going to be in class, which will be on the stimulus motives and the learned motives. So if you have any questions, let me know.